Good evening, everyone. John Drummond here with a great big welcome to the TNT show, The Nation Talks. And you know, it's been another great day for British democracy. And normally at this point in the proceedings, I would make a few hopefully whimsical remarks about the failings of the UK state. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to have a complete change of tone, if you don't mind. I want to talk about something much more serious. I want to talk about morality. Now, I know most people steer away from it. They think, well, it's terribly personal. Morality is the absolute cornerstone of any democracy, frankly. If you don't have moral conduct, ethical conduct, then frankly, you've got a major problem on your hands. And the big worry I have, and it's based partly upon the experience we've had recently in the United States with Donald Trump, but I see the emergence of the same sort of odd relationship to the truth by major political figures. And it saddens me, it really saddens me, because it suggests to me that if one looks at any version of history, there's generally a reckoning when an entity goes takes a cavalier approach, let's put it that way, to the truth. I think the truth matters enormously, and I think morality matters just as much. Anyway, that's my little homily for tonight. Thank you very much for your indulgence. And thank you again for joining us this evening. We have yet another great guest, and I'm really, really excited that he's able to join us tonight. Tonight, the TNT show welcomes Professor Chris Whatley. Now, if you've ever wondered about the Treaty of Union, how it happened, what it is, there's a whole raft of connections to that. Chris literally has written the book. There's no better person in Scotland to offer a view on the Treaty of Union. And, as if that weren't enough, he truly has a deep and abiding interest in Robert Burns. So whatever questions you have on the Treaty of Union, or for that matter, on Robert Burns, and anything else in between, give us a call, let us know, and we'll try and answer your question. And I know for a fact that you'll really enjoy what Chris has to say tonight. And we're taking your questions live, the TNT, The Nation Talks. So in many respects, this is your show. Get your questions in, please. Now, to our guest tonight, The Nation Talks to Chris Whatley. Chris, how have you been affected by the pandemic?
Well, like everybody, I've been locked in, it seems, for nearly a year now. I'm living in my bubble, but desperate to break the bubble. And of course, as a history man, the great frustration of the present era, if you like, of the past year has been we can't get into archives. So I'm desperate to get back into the raw meat that historians live on, and that's the documents in the National Library and the National Records and so on and so forth. So it's a frustrating time. But nevertheless, we've got to go through this. Yeah.
Now, are any of these documents digitized? Is there any way you can access them online?
Some of them are digitized, but it's great that so many are being digitized. And I can't fault, the National Records in terms of what they're trying to do, but they've got a vast quantity of material in there, and only a fraction has been digitized. It takes time and money to do that, yeah. So it's the progress is being made, but it's slow.
Okay, tell us about Chris Whatley. Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
Well, it might surprise you when you hear my accent that I was actually born in Birmingham. but quickly in my life, my parents realised the error of their ways, and they brought me to Glasgow, where I was brought up on the outskirts in the suburbs of Glasgow. And I spent most of my, all of my boyhood years there until I came to the east to Dundee and St Andrews it would be about 1980.
Yeah. Now you left school at 16.
Yep. That was, in my younger days, I was not an academic success. They might call me a professor now, but I certainly showed no signs that was going to be my future. At 11, when I flunked the 11 plus and ended up not doing Latin and French, but doing lots of metalwork and art and arithmetic. I was in the girls' arithmetic class. And I was a bit of a rebel, actually, a bit of a scoundrel. And eventually, when I just about to turn 16, the headmaster phoned my mother and said, we can't do anything more for Christopher. And so I was, I don't know about expelled, but I certainly was left. But I had a little reference with me. He gave me a reference to say that I'd make a very good shop assistant and that I would get 2 O grades. I actually only got 1. He was being over optimistic about my academic prowess. But so I left school at 16. My mother was not pleased. She said, okay, you leave school, but you now pay board and lodging. So in those days, there were lots of jobs around actually for lads that age. So I looked in what was then the Glasgow Evening Citizen in Glasgow, got myself a job by the next week as a salesman in Halfords. And I did that for a year or so. And then I moved to the Mulgai Co-op, where I worked as it's really basically a message boy. Although on a Saturday, I was allowed to work at the cheese counter, which was a big thrill for me at the time. But then I went to Collins's in Glasgow to work as we were then in Cathedral Street, but they're now in Bishop Briggs. But Collins is the publishers, and I served my time as a semi-skilled machine operator, which was interesting to say at least, mind-numbingly dull. But nevertheless, these were great times for a young guy. I was in my teens. I was quite well paid because they were doing 2 nights and a Saturday morning overtime. We're into Burton's for suits, had Lauder's Bar in Renfield Street, and there was a great club scene in Glasgow at that time. So I really enjoyed going to the Elizabethan and Locarno and all these kind of things. But however, when I got to about 1920, my foreman, my gaffer in Collins's, came to me one day and said, well, Chris, you've now finished your time, you served your time, you now have a job for life. And I thought, oh my God, is this it? And so that was a bit of a wake-up call. And that same gaffer actually was a diehard socialist actually. And he must have seen something in me, because when we went out for parts for a machine one day, we drove past Strathclyde University, and he said, you should be in there. And thereafter, he gave me little clues and hints as to what I should be doing. And ultimately, I then did a night class to see if I did have any academic ability. And I got a higher English at night class. And then I needed to get lots more, or another 4 hires to get into university. And that was where I hit a bit of not a brick wall, but certainly there was a hurdle, because the Education Authority, looking at my school record, wouldn't give me a grant to go to college, which I needed to do to get these hires. So I worked tremendously hard for the last few months of my time in Collins, saved up and with a bit of parental support, but basically paid my way through a crash course at Clydebank Technical College doing my hires. And that was a wonderful time as well. And you mentioned Robert Burns, that's when I first became interested in him. But so I got my hires and I went to Strathclyde, and I stayed there for 7 years because I did an honours degree, and then I stayed for a PhD as well.
And then you moved where?
I then moved to Ayr. I was then married to an Ayrshire lass. But at the same time, because Clydebank Technical College had been so transformational for me, I wanted to work in FE, further education. So I went to Ayr College and did 3 or 4, 5 years actually there. But then, when you've done a PhD and really immersed yourself in a subject, as I had, you really become, in some respects, unemployable, because you want to get that buzz again. You want to get involved deeply in a subject.
Yeah.
So I really needed to get back into it, not back into it, but I needed to get an academic job, which I did in 1979-80, and at University of Dundee, and moved to Dundee.
And did you move straight to the chair of?
Oh no! It was a long time before I proved myself in the academic. Well, if indeed if I've ever done so, but no, I was a slow burn, and so I was at Dundee, and then I went in 1988 to St Andrews for a few years, which was, in some respects, a wonderful experience. I learned about academic excellence. I worked with some wonderful people, worked with Chris Smout, the historiographer royal. That was enormously important for me. And in fact, it made me as a historian. I learned my trade there. I really learned what you needed in order to be good at this discipline. And I came back to Dundee, and thereafter I was promoted to a professorship in 1997, I think it was.
And what are the qualities you need to be a professor?
Well, you've got to know what you're talking. You have to profess something. Usually, although these days professors can be awarded for other kind of activities, not disreputable activities, but for some other attributes and skills, being able to manage, for example. But in my case, the academic professorships are based on your reputation in your subject, your having proven or being able to prove that you've done something substantial, that you're respected, not only in your own country, but these days, the promoting authorities look for international referees as well. So you've got to be pretty good, I think, to rise to that level. And I was always amazed that I was throughout my life, John. When I got my higher English after having one O level, I was amazed to get that. When I passed my first year at uni, I thought, my goodness me, these people haven't spotted me yet. And then I got an ordinary degree, and then an honours degree, and I've always been surprised at at the way I've been recognised, if you like, and delighted as well. The discipline, the subject has done me enormously well. I've been tremendously lucky.
I don't think you're alone in that feeling that you have, because when I set up the first company on business ethics, Integrity Works, I spent a lot of time with boards of directors across the world. And we used to talk frankly, candidly, and very often, well, not very often, but often enough, people would say to me, I often wonder if people know how insecure I feel about this whole thing. And these were people, leaders, thousands of people looked up to them. And they said, I just wonder if people knew how much self-will it takes for me to do what I need to do and take the decisions I need to take. And there's always that sense that, you're going to be rumbled. So I think it's a fairly common feeling. And I think it's actually quite an attribute, because I suspect it makes you work even harder to your discipline, perhaps.
Well, I think that's true, and in my case, because there was that, I got into academic life later than many people. I felt that I had to work tremendously hard to catch up, to read things that everybody else had read, and it was hard. So that's the other. Unless you're very lucky, that's the other aspect of professorship. You do have to have grafted away at your subject, and to feel pretty much on top of it, and to be pretty much on top of it.
Now, I said earlier, Chris, that you'd written a book on called The Scots and the Union, about the Treaty of Union. What led you to that, and what conclusions did you reach in the book?
Oh, that's a big question. I'd long been interested in the Union. I'd been interested in it since I did my PhD, but in a very minor way. And when I first got interested in it, I was interested in the economics of union, basically. And I was contributing, I was writing bits and pieces, but I wasn't really saying anything new. I was arguing that the Union was forged on the basis of Scotland's economic interests, basically. That was the deciding factor. But when I realised in probably around 2000, the 300th anniversary of the Union was coming up in 2007, I thought, right, I don't really know as much about this subject as I should. I don't really know about the individuals. I don't really know much about the motivations of those parliamentarians concerned. So actually, a lot of people say about me that I'm a unionist historian. I'm not. I'm a historian of the Union. And really and honestly, not everyone will believe this, I went into that project really as a voyage of discovery. I wanted to take myself step by step from the 1690s through the early 18th century up to the period of the Union and ask myself what was going on, who was driving this, what were the drivers, what about ordinary people, what were they thinking about as this debate was taking place. And so what I guess surprised me, John, as a result of that work was that with a research assistant I had called Derek Patrick, we discovered, I think, and I think we were more or less the first people to say this, that actually, in spite of the fact that so many people talk about the Union in terms of being bought and sold for English gold, that the Scots were let down by their nobility, if you like, and led into this arrangement with England. We found actually that there were several Scots of some significance who actually argued for the Union and felt that it was a positive thing on its own, not only for economic reasons but for other reasons too. So there were individuals who were arguing, well, look, this was Scotland. Scotland does need a bigger market. So the economic thing still stands, if you like, was still part of the consideration. But there were other aspects too, like, for example, we live on this one piece of land called Britain. We shouldn't be divided. We shouldn't have a border there. We speak more or less the same language, albeit, there were Gaelic speakers in Scotland. There were other interests too, common interests, defence. I mean, France at the time was the dominant world power and was threatening under Louis XIV. And so there were Scots who felt that a closer relationship with England would be helpful in terms of protecting Scotland. And remember too that Scotland at this time was Protestant. And so religion was a big factor at the time. Catholic France and Presbyterian Protestant Scotland, which might have been threatened had Louis XIV become more aggressive, if you like. So there were a number of good reasons, if you like, at the time for this union. And so our argument was that that these individuals didn't just decide at the last minute to vote for union, that they'd been driving in this direction since the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1689, that they saw union as a way of finalising, securing that revolution, which had seen off James and ultimately saw the Hanoverians on the British throne.
And what did you establish about the reaction of the ordinary person? Because there's a certain body of literature that suggests that the average man and woman in the street were a bit upset by the whole thing, and it was the elite who carried the day, as it were.
Certainly, that's partly true. I think that what I found most interesting about what was going on the streets, so to speak, or outside Parliament, was the extent to which there was a variety of opinion, great diversity of opinion. The Scottish, I really object these days when politicians tell me about the Scottish people think this, the Scottish people opinion. Scotland was divided then, and Scotland was divided. Scotland is divided now, and it was divided then. There were a variety of opinions. However, having said that, and I would concede that in terms of the evidence that there is out there, there was more popular opposition to the union than there was feeling for it. And indeed, but the crowd, if you like, the crowd on the streets of Edinburgh had a remarkable influence, I think, on proceedings inside the Parliament. So, for example, there was a fear, a panic developed in the late months of 1706 that the regalia of Scotland, the honours of Scotland, were going to be taken from Scotland and maybe melted down in London and turned into playthings for Queen Anne or something of that sort. However, such was the concern in the Scottish Parliament that would happen, that the Treaty of Union, the Articles of Union, were amended it was agreed that forever the honours of Scotland would remain in Scotland. Same as the records of Scotland would remain in Scotland. So, and they have done so ever since. So that's an example, if you like, of the people on the streets influencing what was going on inside Parliament. And as well, the other thing, do stop me if I'm going on at length about this, but another aspect of it, of the union debate, was that petitions were sent to Parliament from, say, the boroughs of Scotland with particular concerns about articles of the union concerning coal or salt or beer or whatever. And the articles were adjusted, were amended as the debate was going on through the Scottish Parliament. So it wasn't, I don't see the union as a diktat, because A, it was amended, and B, as those Scots who went to London to negotiate the terms of the union were keen to secure, were the fundamentals of Scottish society. That is, the church, education system, the convention of royal boroughs. Aspects of Scottish society were preserved within the Union Treaty, which makes this union that we've had with England a bit different than some other more aggressive, oppressive unions that have been forged in Europe and other parts of the world in succeeding centuries.
Here's a question, I mean, almost inevitable question. Had there been a referendum back in 1706, do you think the no or the yes side, i.e. the no to union, would have won that referendum, or would they have lost it?
Well, as you say, it's a tricky question. It's a trick question because, of course, well, the answer is we just don't know. I'll tell you what I would guess, though. One thing that we kind of ignore is that I think that there would have been a no to an incorporating union, that is a surrender of the Parliament. Absolutely no doubt about that. But what was not really a big issue at the time was a relationship with England. There was already, of course, a relationship with England, the Union of the Crowns, which wasn't working very well, and certainly many Scots saw it as working against Scotland's interests. But there was very little talk at the time of a break with England. I think it had the English politicians been prepared to accept a form of federalism, if you like, that would have probably won the day. Very few people were calling for a break with England. What we wanted was what I think would have been popular would have been a sort of form of home rule, a retention of the Scottish Parliament, but yeah.
Isn't one of the things that clouds the whole issue, though, is the fact that there were bribes were paid to secure votes?
Yeah, well, that's part of the traditional tale. And of course, money was sent north of the border to secure or to help to secure the union. But really, when you look at the list of individuals who received sums of money from England, actually, several of those individuals would have voted for the union anyway. They didn't need the money. They were being paid back salaries, if you like. They were owed a lot of money because they hadn't been paid for a few years in the service of the Crown. But the more important thing, John, than that, I think, is that the work we did, as I said earlier, traced back unionist support right back to 1689, and in some cases before that. So these were committed unionists who, and there was a considerable body of these within the Union Parliament, if you like. So yes, there was some bribery, but I think it's been hugely exaggerated, its influence.
Didn't some of those bribes not get paid on time and led to the Royal Bank of Scotland at some stage down the line?
Well, that was less bribes. I think that was more the equivalent and repayment of sums invested in the Company of Scotland, which, as you know, had come to a rather disastrous end in 1700.
There's a lot of talk. Often people mention the Darien disaster and claim that that's what swayed a number of influential people to look more kindly on it, on an incorporating union than they might otherwise have done?
Yeah, I think that was an important factor, because what we've got to remember that in the late 17th, early 18th century, the world was a pretty rough place actually, and on the high seas, merchant ships were being, attacked by pirates and privateers and so forth. And the big powers in Europe were establishing empires overseas. Now, we may want to criticize that nowadays, but at the time, empires were important. Overseas colonies were important to provide raw materials, and perhaps gold and silver, and as markets for Scottish or the home nation's goods. But Scotland had tried to establish such colonies during the 17th century, including at Darien, but had failed. And so there was a view taken that, that we need the protection of the British Navy. We need access to England's overseas empire, and England had done better, and not because the English are intrinsically better or anything. It's just that they were the bigger population, more powerful, more finance, and yes, so Darien did lead some people in that direction. It also caused some people to become more anti-English or anti the arrangement that was then on the table or in operation in terms of Scotland's relations with England.
How much influence do you think the Alien Act had on the final decision?
It certainly brought people up with a start, in the sense of recognizing that, it had a number of reactions, but one was anger, another was a recognition that we do have to treat with England, that we need to negotiate here. And as I say, there were politicians who took the view that because the union, as laid down in the articles, was going to repay the Scots for the Darien losses, because it was going to open, or the English market was going to open. Scotland was going to have access to England's colonies in the Caribbean and so forth. That is a deal worth doing. But I don't think that, I think it's worth saying this, there wasn't much celebration in Scotland about this union. It wasn't a matter of national rejoicing. The rejoicing took place in London, because the Scots had been not necessarily bought off, but certainly quietened through this union.
Yeah. The thinking about that big picture again, maybe one of the features of an incorporated union, and I don't want to lead you here, and if you feel this is mistaken, please do correct me, and I'm sure you will. But one of the features of an incorporated union is the implicit, perhaps, acceptance of parliamentary sovereignty. In other words, you cannot have popular sovereignty if the new incorporation adheres to parliamentary sovereignty.
So I'm not quite clear what you're driving at.
There are presently two views on sovereignty across the island, I would say. There's the one based on the claim of right, which says that sovereignty is vested in the Scottish people. There's the other view of sovereignty which is that sovereignty is vested in the Crown and Parliament. And my question is, would a non-incorporated union have been able to enshrine parliamentary sovereignty in a way that perhaps a non-incorporated union would find great difficulty doing?
I'm struggling with this one. I'm struggling with this one. Certainly the incorporating union, which saw the end of the Scottish Parliament, made it more difficult, obviously, for Scotland for Scottish interest to be served, if you like. Having said that, I think the Scots over time did very well through in terms of lobbying the Westminster Parliament. Yeah. So, for example, in the, there were the Jacobite risings, of course, in the aftermath of the Union, and that caused the Westminster government, or Walpole and other English ministers, to recognise that Scotland, the Scots, can be dangerous. And underemployed Scots in particular can be dangerous and lured into the Jacobite armies. And so there was a recognition that the Union, which is supposed to be equal treatment across the board, there was a recognition that Scotland needed to be treated differently. And so support was given to Scottish industries, in particular the linen industry. Now, you might think this is boring, but the linen industry was the major industry, the major source of employment, earnings, overseas earnings for the Scots in the 18th century, led to cotton in Glasgow and Paisley and jute and so forth in Dundee. Enormously important, and that's because Westminster did recognise there was a Scottish, there were distinct Scottish issues here which need to be dealt with by giving favourable treatment to Scotland in terms of duties and bounties and so forth.
I think that's very helpful. I think the point I was driving at was a slightly different one, which is that if you have a treaty or a contract of any kind, there's generally some mechanism which deals with contraventions of that contract. Where's the mechanism to deal with any contraventions of the Treaty of Union?
Well, that's a good question, and that is something which we could talk about for a long time, because it's very hard to see where they are, other than where we are currently right now. That is a position being taken by Scotland or by the Scottish electorate, presumably when we have if we have another referendum.
So that would be the mechanism for dealing with changes in the Union. Because, I mean, we've had, for example, English votes for English laws, which sounds a bit like a change in the relationship.
Yeah.
Quite a serious change, one might argue. And one would look generally to the terms of the contract or the treaty and say, does that comply with it or doesn't it? If it doesn't comply, it's invalid. If it does, then fine. Because we have no constitution to speak of.
No.
It's written down anywhere. So,
but the Articles of Union have been amended and altered and even ignored over the centuries. And and were from the very start, really. I mean, the Union actually, in the Articles, you'll find words to the effect that the nations of that place called Scotland will no longer exist. England will no longer exist. We'll have North Britain and South Britain. So that was what was supposed to happen. But of course, well, the Scots for the time called themselves the North British, but there was very rarely any Englishman or woman calling themselves Southern British. So from the very start, there was some rewriting or reinterpreting of what those articles meant.
Yeah, but isn't that the very issue that bedevils any notion of any halfway house, as it were, of extended devolution or federalism? Is it would require the larger partner to accept significant constitutional change in order to accommodate the other partner. And there doesn't seem to be any great evidence of anyone wishing for any changes to the English constitution. I mean, I look at, for example, the House of Lords, which remains unreformed despite many attempts otherwise. You can look at other parts of the British Constitution, which many people would argue are greatly in need of reform, but yet nothing much happens because there's perhaps an innate conservatism. I'm not sure what it is, but it just doesn't happen. So it would be a huge ask, wouldn't it, to say to these folks who are not desirous of great constitutional change, to say, you're going to have to thole this in order to keep these characters north of the border happy. It's hard to see how that might happen.
I think you're right, my position on these things is probably a bit different than yours and some of your viewers and listeners. However, I think it's getting late in the day for if you like, the elite in south of the border to make the kind of concessions or to recognise some of the issues as seen from where we are currently in Scotland. I think that the whole Brexit thing has revealed, if you like, attitudes in south of the border which are not going to be helpful, are not helpful for Scotland and the peoples of Scotland.
Well, I speak to people who tell me that they believe in home rule, that they would absolutely resent me calling them unionists, but they say they favour some sort of greater devolution. And what saddens them is that the present government appears to be doubling down on issues which cause greater hostility in Scotland. I mean, the things that you mentioned, I mean, now would be the time perhaps to say, because I agree with you, it's getting late in the day. And when it's late in the day, you probably want to be making at least a gesture or two to say, look, we wholly appreciate what's happened, i.e. we accept devolution, we think it's a good thing, and we probably want to see more of it. In fact, the Prime Minister, up until today, has taken the view that devolution is bad, presumably in principle. But today he conceded in Wales that some of it is bad. But others, but not quite so bad. This strikes me as a bizarre position to take.
Yeah, well, it's difficult to have a rational response to a man who's obviously deeply irrational in terms of his political philosophies and pronouncements. But yeah, I mean, I would tend to be a home ruler. I mean, I think one of the regrets I have about recent times is that the Labour Party lost its connection with its home rule roots in the earlier part of the 20th century, and I think we might be in a very different place now if really, the Labour Party, and particularly in the run-up to the referendum, had recognised the feelings of Scots and a pride of Scots in their nation, a recognition that there are distinctive features about Scottish society. I'm not sure that they're so different from parts of England, but nevertheless there is a distinctiveness. And one of the things that I've learned as a Scottish historian over the last 40 years or so, which I didn't realise when I embarked on this career or this journey, is the immense pride there has been among Scots in Scotland over the centuries, and we ignore that at our peril. And I think Labour, in particular, ignored that at its peril in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and indeed up until recently, and still now perhaps. There's still a lot of confusion about what Labour's stance will be in this coming election, about as the Scottish election, about the referendum and what position to take in such a referendum. I much regret that.
Why do you think that happened?
Oh, goodness me, that's well.
I mean, the reason I say that, Chris, is because what you just said will seem to many people as plain as a pikestaff.
Yeah.
Yet a decision was taken to go in the opposite direction.
Yeah. Well, if you listen to someone like Gordon Brown, he was during the 2014 referendum when he did come out, so to speak. What was if you like, he was promoting his reasons for supporting the No campaign. Basically, were that there were many hugely important aspects of the present union that were doing Scotland good. So the welfare state, national welfare state, the ability to share the burden, if you like, of the costs of certain public services, and that those kind of beliefs, and a belief too that class across Britain was more important than nation and identity, I think was very much behind much of the Labour Party thinking in the 60s and 70s. I wasn't involved in a big way, but I was a member at the time, and that's what we were hearing and believed. That socialism, if you like, and the brotherhood, if you like, across the borders, and indeed wider afield was much more important than nationalism, which was seen at the time as parochial and associated with the Tories actually at that time. And I'm talking about the 70s and 80s, really.
Yeah. And yet here we are, where we are. I mean, I very much agree with you. I think if the Labour Party had taken a different view, we would be in a very different position. But I feel that, that horse is bolted, and it's going to be very difficult to get it back into the stable again.
Yeah.
Regardless of what individuals may say, the party has moved on. And sadly, despite all of these movements, it yet to has a great appeal south of the border. I mean, the latest opinion polls put this rather desperate government at 41%, and have Labour around about 35%. Now, obviously, these things can change during an election campaign, but knowing how much money gets thrown at the various programmes, and it's difficult to see how that's going to change in favour of the Labour Party. So again, it's this sense that any cross-island change needs a significant change in England to be able to be in a position to address the needs in Scotland. And personally, I don't see any evidence of that. I mean, I lived in Berkshire for 20 years. I didn't see the slightest concern about Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland or anywhere else. People were concerned about Berkshire and occasionally London. And again, that was partly driven by class, because it was a very sort of conservative area. In fact, I don't think the Labour Party had a candidate, frankly. So, but I mean, it does seem to me that it might need something of that nature. Let me put you on the spot, Chris, because I'd be remiss if I didn't do this. Say, for example, there was a referendum tomorrow.
Sorry, yes.
Would you be on the no side or the yes side, or where would you be?
Oh dear, John, that's I'll tell you what. I'll step back a bit and I'll get round to that perhaps. I dislike binary choices in referendum. I think they are deeply damaging. I am concerned, seriously concerned, about the kind of winner takes all approach that follows from these kind of choices. And I still feel that there are sores in Scotland following the last, as a result of the last referendum, divisions in families and in communities, which are still around there. And I could tell you some horror stories, but I won't. And so it concerns me that I ask myself, do our politicians, are they statesmen and stateswomen enough to recognise that our yes vote will hurt a great number of people, that vote will be, or will that yes vote, if that's what comes about, or will that be described as the position or the decision of the Scottish people, which I think is I think we talked about it earlier on. I dislike that term. It would be the decision of a significant proportion of the electorate. And for if Scotland is to succeed on its own afterwards, we will need to be together, our shoulders collectively behind the wheel. There will be such work to be done. economically and socially and in all sorts of ways to turn Scotland into the sort of nation that we would want it to be. But I have seen little evidence that our politicians understand that. I mean, for example, you would not know if you'd come to this part of the country from another planet that the no vote won the last referendum in 2014. There's very little, as far as I can read and hear, very little recognition of that, and a sort of an attempt to persuade, to bring the people together behind a kind of yes vote. But as I say, the binary nature of referendums, I think, militates against that, and that does concern me. If I had more faith in our political class, I would be more inclined to be sympathetic to a yes vote. But you asked a question, and I will answer today because I have not seen any evidence of that, and I have not seen any compelling response to the question about Scotland's economic future. I would probably be veering towards no.
Would you describe yourself as a soft no?
Well, I would need an awful lot of softening up. But I doubt very much it will be out campaigning on the streets for that. But I would rather that the politicians and those folks who are going to drive a referendum a yes campaign, if we have that, I would rather they listen to people like me, because there are many of us out here who want to be taken seriously and have serious questions to ask about what we're going to do in the next 10, 25 years while we deal with the economic problems, challenges Scotland faces. And if we think that Brexit has caused chaos in the aftermath of where we are now and being free from Europe, if you like, you ain't seen nothing compared to it yet, because the breaking up of a union of 300 years duration is going to be an immensely difficult task, which wasn't confronted at all in the documents we saw from the Scottish government prior to the last referendum. I mean, there were joke figures in that, 200 million pounds to set up a new state machine. Well, come off it.
Okay, so you wouldn't be campaigning. I guess one of the predicaments that anyone opposed to significant constitutional change, and independence, when faced with a binary choice, it's a horrible choice. I completely accept your point of view, because if you say I'm advocating no, effectively you're saying yes to Boris Johnson in perpetuity. And no, you can't go that far. You cannot go that far. No, Boris Johnson is not going to live forever. I mean, this is the other thing that we've got to be careful not to take too seriously the present, and things that will be passive, fleeting issues like a Tory government, that will not necessarily be the same for all time. I very much hope it isn't. Yeah. Well, the opinion polls would suggest otherwise, but these things change. You're quite right. Thank you very much for that. That was very helpful, Chris. I appreciate that. We spent a bit of time talking about the union. Let's do a complete change if we can. Tell us about the Hebrides and tell us about Pabby. Have I pronounced that properly?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. What is your interest in this tiny Hebridean island?
Well, that's an interesting question, and it takes us back to the beginning about my coming from being born in England and my English family. Well, another branch of the family moved to Skye just at the same time as my branch of the family was coming to Glasgow, and my uncle, who was we come from rural stock, if you like, originally. My grandfather was an agricultural labourer from the age of 11. So there's a rural root in the Whatleys, if you like. And my uncle, who had been a conscientious objector during the Second World War, had been sent to work in the fields with German prisoners of war. My grandfather had been an ILP member, and he was in Wormwood Scrubs and Wakefield Jail during the First World War on political grounds. He'd refused to fight in the First World War. So anyway, after the Second World War, during the Second World War, my uncle had learned a love of the land, basically. Wanted to be a farmer, had no money. He was, relatively ordinary character. But in 1949, he went to holiday on Skye with his young wife, and they saw this little island, which looked beautiful, green and fertile, lying off Broadford in the Isle of Skye. And to cut a long story short, they visited it, and they thought it was wonderful. They thought this is where they could maybe start a little farm or farm and make a living. And within a few months, he had found out who owned the island. He'd made arrangements to buy it, or certainly to borrow money to buy it, because they didn't have any money we're talking about. But they'd made arrangements to secure the island, if you like. And he and his children, 2 children then, ultimately more than that, lived and worked on that island for the best part of 20 years. And the importance of it for me is that I was on that island from the age of 3 for part of every year subsequently until my late teens, because for me it was just a wonderful, magical place to be. But also there was a kind of family aspect to it, that we would go up whenever we could to help, to clear a ditch or to feed hens or whatever jobs there were. And that's another aspect of who I am, actually, which you were asking about earlier on. And that is this individual who can actually be, although I might spend my time in books and papers and all that stuff, I can actually do useful things too, make things, build things, dig things, be resilient, because you have to be on an island. It was a deserted island, nobody living there. And there was no electricity, there was, it was remote. But it was a remarkable thing to do for a guy who had been brought up in the English Midlands and spoke no Gaelic and had no experience of Skye, but my family are still there, actually. My cousin, they discovered some clay on Parry, my uncle did. He got interested in pottery, and after they left the island, set up a little pottery in Edinburgh on Skye, which is still going, and it's now a big pottery run by my cousin. So the Whatleys are very, very much part of Skye society these days, although we still can't speak Gaelic.
How do you get to Parry? Once you've got to Skye, how do you get to Parry?
Well, you get a boat, basically, a little boat. There's no boat service, obviously. So when I was a young teenager and things were different in those days, my mum would put me, or I would even get the bus into Queen Street Station, get on the train to Mallaig, 6 o'clock in the morning, arrive at Mallaig, get on the ferry that took me to Armadale, catch a bus to take me from Broadford. I'd stand on the pier at Broadford, the wee jetty there, and my aunt would see me. I'm a little like Paddington Bear with a wee bag, and a boat, and my uncle or one of the people he worked with would come and collect me. Yeah,
it was. So like the island is actually quite close.
Yeah, well, a couple of miles. Yeah.
Oh well.
On a rough sea, it seems a lot further than that.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. Tell us a little bit. We don't have much time left, but tell us a little bit about your interest in Robert Burns.
Yeah, Robert Burns. Well, as I say, I got interested in Robert Burns when I was at college in Clydebank, because there was a young man there, a fellow student, who came from Dumfries and pointed me in the direction of Burns. But I remember that at that time in my life, I was not highly educated. I hadn't read much poetry, but I really enjoyed that. And in fact, what we did in our English class at Clydebank was we wrote and produced a play in which I appeared, believe it or not, as Robert Burns, but nothing came of it. However, I from that period onwards, I loved reading Robert Burns's poems and listening to his songs and so forth. And then, why did I write a book about it? Which is, I guess, where the question's headed, and because I was asked to contribute to a conference about 10 years ago, and I wondered what I could say. But a question that I had been asking myself over the years as I'd wandered around Scotland is, why were there so many Burns statues? What did this mean? There's a lot of work goes into raising money for a statue, finding a site for, commissioning a sculptor, and so on and so forth. And I discovered that these were, A, there was a lot of them, and B, there was a huge amount of public interest in those statues and in celebrating Burns. And so I asked questions about what that was all about. And my conclusion, to cut a long story short, John, was that I realised, which I hadn't realised before, that Burns was so important to the Scottish people in the 19th century. Much more so than I'd recognised, not just as a poet, as a singer, but as somebody who represented certain values, like a man's a man for all that, which was inspirational for trade unionists, ordinary people in the 19th century, and inspired ordinary people to write poetry, to get involved politically, and indeed to raise these statues and to attend in their tens of thousands the unveilings of these things. I just could not believe, as I was discovering this, how important Burns was, and in a meaningful sense, not just a once in January, every January sort of Burns supper type way, but in terms of influencing people's everyday lives and giving them a sense of dignity, self-worth. Because that's, of course, what Burns is, or one of Burns's messages was. So hugely important, inspirational figure, and had been missing in that regard for most of the social histories of 19th and 20th century Scotland.
I agree with that. I'm always struck wherever I go and spend any time with people in their homes. There's invariably a volume or two of Burns. Wherever you go in Scotland,
yeah.
It's
and that was the case. You would get your ordinary people's homes, cottages from in rural places. There would be a Bible and a book of poems by Burns.
Yeah. And that's extraordinary. I mean, I know all countries have their national bards, and it's not uncommon for them to be hugely popular, but somehow it's different with Burns. It seems to be, I'm not quite sure what motivates the interest. It seems to me it's more than the words somehow. It's what he conveys, some symbolic, perhaps, connection.
Well, that, and I think the language is important too. That at the time he was writing, and certainly in the decades after he died, there was enormous pressure to speak English. Standard of English. But Burns actually, he uses Scottish words and phrases and modulations and so on and so forth, which I think resonated with people who felt it's okay to be ourselves, to speak our language, to speak the way we do, and indeed to celebrate that. And so actually, in terms of, say, Scottish nationalism nowadays, Burns was hugely important in carrying, in promoting and being, if you like, the symbol of Scottishness during the 19th and early 20th century.
Great. Well, that's a great note to end on. Thank you very much indeed. I appreciate it, Chris. Kind of you to give us your time, kind of you to answer our questions. And we should try and keep this debate going. I think in some respects, we've only scratched the surface. A big thank you. And a big thank you to all of you tonight for watching and listening. Again, we have a formidable list of guests lined up. Next week, we have a hugely interesting, very interesting woman on. It's Shoa Kay. You may recall that her husband, Billy, was a guest on the show some months ago, talking about Scotland and talking about his books on Scotland. Shoa, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Shoa, is Portuguese by birth. So join us next week. And from her, she is in a perfect position to talk about the relationship between Portugal and Spain and what that might have in terms of the relationship between Scotland and England. You've got a big neighbour next to a small country, and the impact that Portugal had on changing attitudes within Spain as a result of the Carnation Revolution in 1974. So much to talk about with Shoah next week. Do join us. And also, please, look out for Dr. Elliot Bulmer's Constitution column in the Sunday National this weekend. It's always great reading. If you're looking for erudition about constitutional matters, there's no one better than Dr. Bulmer. It's in the 7-day section, by the way. And also, as I say every week, please tune into Indie Live. There's a huge, great depth of programming on Indie Live. You're sure to find something that you like, hopefully in addition to the TNT show. And you'll find all the details at www.whatsonguide.scot. It's there. You can follow all the guests who are coming up on the TNT show in the weeks to come. And thank you again for joining us. A big thank you to Chris Whatley, and a big thank you to you. And remember, it's been a great day for British democracy. Good night all. Take care. Stay safe.